Hello and welcome to the Craft Beer Corner. For today's beer review, we're jumping into, as you ought to know by now, one of my favorite beer styles, and that is Imperial Stouts, and both of these are bourbon barrel aged. One is from a brewer I've never had before. One is from a brewer I've had quite a few now, all of which have been great. So we're going to be starting today with Crux Fermentation Project's Tough Love. This is part of their Banished series. This is a Kentucky Bourbon Barrel Aged Imperial Stout, clocks in at 11.5% ABV. Crux Fermentation Project is based in Bend, Oregon. This one was also specifically brewed with blackstrap molasses and additional spices. For number two, keeping true to form, they're very simple and clean design on their labels. This is Friem's Bourbon Barrel Imperial Stout. This one obviously Bourbon Barrel Aged Imperial Stout as well. Slightly lower ABV at 11%, and Friem is based in Hood River, Oregon. So we've got two Bourbon Barrel Aged Imperial Stouts, both out of the state of Oregon. And I mean, it's hard to go wrong with a Barrel Aged Imperial Stout. Hard to go wrong with an Imperial Stout, period. And then barrel aging, it just adds another dimension of flavor and aroma. So I'm going to get jumping right in. This is Crux Fermentation Project's Tough Love. This one clocks in at 11.5% ABV. Okay, so jumping into the first beer of today's Bourbon Barrel Aged Imperial Stout review, also both beers out of the state of Oregon, so we're really narrowing the field. This is Crux Fermentation Project's Tough Love, part of their Banished series, Bourbon Barrel Aged Imperial Stout, 11.5% ABV. They're based in Bend, Oregon. This one's Kentucky Bourbon Barrel Aged, also brewed with blackstrap molasses and additional spices. So first thing first, Crux, I'm saying that because I assume that's how most people would pronounce it. Crux is really the correct pronunciation of the word, so I might use them interchangeably. Please forgive me, but whichever you prefer, I've got you covered. Nonetheless, first thing first, in terms of label art, it's relatively simplistic. It's very dark, and it's probably impossible to see in the camera, but there's alternating knives and hearts flipped upside down and right side up across the background of the label. So, you know, it's kind of a little kitschy play on words. This one is wax dipped, so we got our handy dandy, nice pointy tipped bottle opener here that will score right under the edge of the cap, and with all luck be able to get this off on first try. Been lucky the last few wax bottles I've done. Yep, and there we go. So pried that one right off, no problem. So let's get this poured right in the old stout glass. Gently, all right. Now a good bit of agitation, let it form a head. I can see this is looking very dark and quite thick. All right, now I'm gonna ease off the pour just a little bit. We can top that up. I can tell you that the aroma is quite pronounced, and it is essentially what you would expect. Tons of bourbon with underlying deep, rich layers of roasted malt underneath it. So it's exactly what you expect from a barrel-aged Imperial Stout. Holding it up visually, it's absolutely pitch black, yet again as expected for an Imperial Stout. Did form a very nice, tight, creamy, lush head on top. Let's get right up over it for a proper sniff. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Oh, there's a lot of layers of aroma there. So the bourbon jumps right out at you. Paired with the bourbon, you're getting some underlying kind of vanilla, and they added blackstrap molasses. That's an aroma and a flavor you can often get in barrel-aged beers, particularly bourbon, but you definitely pick it up on the aroma. You can smell that molasses in there. It's, you know, caramelized, very, very deeply caramelized, and it smells like it. And all of these flavors, or rather aromas, I'm sure the flavors as well, but all of these aromas are binding very well to what is clearly a very nice classic Imperial Stout malt bill. So there's tons and tons of roasty notes underneath. I'm not really picking up any coffee vibe, but I can definitely smell the roasting in the malt and all that the bourbon barrel has imparted to this beer. Aside from that, there are some additional kind of aromas on here. They said they added spices. I don't know specifically what spices they may have used, but there is a suggestion of maybe some nutmeg, maybe some cinnamon, maybe hints of citrus zest. It's hard to tell, but that's what it smells like on the nose. It smells very, very nice. So let's go ahead and get this one topped up here. Just a little bit. I still don't think we'll get the whole bottle in. No, we won't, but we can top it off. Still a lovely, creamy, pillowy, foamy head on top. Let's jump right in. Oh yeah. Oh yeah, that's a big beer right there. Oh wow. Okay, you know, it's a style I absolutely love. And anytime I get to try a new one, it's a treat. And anytime I get to try a new beer from a new brewer, it's a treat. So a special treat, one of my favorite beer styles by a new brewer. And let me tell you, this one's incredible. Absolutely incredible. All right, so all of the characteristics you would expect from a good barrel-aged imperial stout are present. As soon as you get it in the mouth, you start to agitate. That bourbon really wakes up on the palate. You can taste it very clearly. It's very pungent. As soon as you swallow, that bourbon comes into full force. There's a little bit of a boozy hit to it, but it's not overly boozy. Just a little bit. Oh yeah, that's some bourbon barrel imparting some characteristics into this beer. It comes through quite clearly. Then as the intensity of that kind of backs off and starts to even out a bit, that's when this rush of the roasted malt just comes into full force. And it's deep, 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 deep roasting here. Deep, deep, deep roasting. Very, very almost earthy, like in the sense that it plays. There are some underlying kind of chocolate-like qualities. And this is not sweet chocolate. This is baker's chocolate. Very dark, dense, rich, true cacao is really more what I should say versus chocolate. And then there is a little hint of coffee-like undertones, but this one has less of a coffee-like flavor profile than many, many Imperial Stout malt bills. So this one's playing a lot more on the deep, earthy, and kind of char side, and that's mixing with this big, robust bourbon barrel back to it. Now, the molasses quality does come through. That binds both with the bourbon and with the roasty malt bill. No question about it. The spices that they added, I'm not really picking up a ton of flavoring agent, but it did add a ton to the aroma. I don't know what specifically they used, but I did tell you what it smelled like to me. So my first sip reaction is, heck yes, absolutely delicious, as expected. So let's jump in for body and mouthfeel, pick apart this flavor, and then finish a bit. This is maybe not as heavy as I would anticipate, but it's a strong, solid medium heavy. 11.5%, that's a pretty high ABV for the style I expected to be big. It does have a big presence, but I kind of expected it to be maybe leaning more strongly in the heavy category. But it's a solid, strong, medium heavy body. In terms of mouthfeel, the mouthfeel is viscous. It's resistant. It's not syrupy, but it's what you would expect for the style in this ABV range to be certain. When you agitate around the palate, it does start to get quite creamy, but it's much more fine. It's not foamy, it's fine. It silkens up is the best way to describe it. In terms of the flavor development, everything I got on that first sip, yet again, and as per usual with most beers, intensifies a bit on the second sip. So everything I got up front, it's just kind of solidifying, yep, that's what I got, or saying, hey, you didn't pick this up the first time, check this out. In this case, it's just an intensifying of what I picked up on first sip. So the bourbon presence gets even bigger, the slight booziness to it gets even bigger, the underlying kind of vanilla and molasses qualities that are inherent from the barrel aging and the added blackstrap molasses are really coming through, and the deep level of roast and char and earthiness from the malt bill is amplified even more than that. So it's kind of got the full Monty here. This is just a very intense, well done, classic barrel-aged Imperial Stout that honestly, I'm having a hard time finding a fault in this. It's just impressively well done. Impressively well done. In terms of the finish, this is one of those stouts that is not dry at all. It's wet and round to the end, and the flavor intensity is pretty substantial, even long after your sip. There's a whole lot of roasty malt character that is just piercing on the back of the palate as well as that bourbon barrel. So the finish on this one is very, very long indeed. And it lingers with an intensity that you don't get in a lot of beers. This beer, you know when you've had a sip of it because it sticks with you. And for my money, that's just a tremendous and wonderful thing. Let's talk balance here. The balance struck between the malt bill, the added flavoring agents, and that barrel, all top notch. The bourbon barrel and all of its related qualities and characteristics come through perfectly clearly. The same is true for the malt bill, and it's just a beautiful, harmonious balance between the barrel and the malt. And I mean, that's exactly what you hope for in a barrel-aged beer, and this has done spectacularly. And I have to add, I don't know specifically what type of bourbon barrel they used, but they clearly used a quality barrel and they left it in for a requisite amount of time. This is just a tremendous, tremendous beer. Anybody that likes barrel-aged imperial stouts, this is one that you definitely want to keep on your radar. I'm going to take my time, sip on this, call my scores. When we come back, we will get to our second beer of today's review. That is Friem's Bourbon Barrel Imperial Stout that clocks in just lower at 11% ABV. Okay, now jumping into the second beer of today's Bourbon Barrel Aged Imperial Stout review out of Oregon State. We have got Friem's Bourbon Barrel Imperial Stout. That is both the style and the name of the beer. They keep it simple. They're based in Hood River, Oregon. This one clocks in at 11% ABV. So keeping true with Friem's style, very subdued, very understated in terms of label art. It's just got their kind of insignia on it for the Friem in kind of this gold font, gold print over a nice clean white label. It really, you know, it's not over the top, but it looks fantastic. It really is a super clean design. So let's go ahead and get this one cracked gently. Perfect. And pour it right in the old stout glass here. All right, as I'm pouring this, this looks very thick and very dark. It is both thick and dark. All right, trying to give some good agitation there, give it a chance to form a head. And I think I sped it up enough that it's doing a decent job there. Not bad, not bad. Okay, just as with the first beer, this one has an absolutely impressively pungent aroma. I'm a good 1.5 feet, nearly 2 feet from the edge of this glass, and it is a pungent aroma. And it is this nice mix of bourbon and the malts that I can smell them quite clearly. So let's give it a visual take. Absolutely pitch black. Absolutely pitch black. Head obviously formed a beautiful, thick, dense, creamy, pillowy, foamy head on top. I am not seeing a lot of bubble activity either coming up the glass or in the breakdown of the head. This one I expect is going to be probably at least as good as the first one. Just a nice, wonderful, at-home poured head. Beautiful. Let's give it a proper sniff. Oh, yeah. Okay, so this one, the aroma is not dissimilar to the first. I'm getting a lot more bourbon and bourbon kind of characteristics that are coming through in the aroma than I am the roasty malts. They're there, but they're very much in the background. The bourbon on the nose, at least, is for sure the dominant aroma. There's just a little suggestion of, oh, here's what I might get in the malt bill, but it's kind of going to be a surprise. I expect this going to be quite big, quite intense. I expect the bourbon to be big and intense, but I'm expecting pitch black and thick and true, dark as that is, it's going to have tons of layers of deep, richly roasted malt. The question is, what are they going to be? Are they going to be coffee-like? Are they going to be earthy? Are they going to be smoky? I don't know. I can't tell from the aroma, so it's kind of an interesting one, and I'm quite excited to jump in and find out. So without further ado, let's dive in. Oh, there it is. Okay. So, this beer, quite a bit different than the first one. Shares a lot of commonality, but there are noticeable differences between these two beers. The first thing that I noticed right away is I was agitating this beer around the palate before I sipped. I really was getting nothing. There was no kind of flavor that started to come through at all on the palate before I swallowed. Once I swallowed, it started maybe a second after I swallowed. The flavors started to slowly intensify, and I really mean that, slowly intensify. if we're looking at a bell curve kind of area of a grid here, it was almost like kind of this shape. A very slow creep diagonal, and then boom, there it goes. And then it's holding and it's starting its descent. So the way that this one presents its flavor profile is quite a bit different than the first, in that it lacks that bold punch, upfront intensity. It's a lot more subtle. It's a lot more restrained in the way that it presents itself, but it's equally packed, absolutely full of flavor. It just takes a few seconds for it to come into its own, and then bam, it's there. And it's holding and it's letting you explore everything you're tasting, and then it starts the descent off the back end of the bell curve. So it's almost it's almost like a flat top pyramid shape. It's kind of the shape of this bell curve. Slow ramp up, nice even plateau, sustains, and then a slow even drop. That's kind of how the way this beer presents its flavors. So what I got, at least on initial sip, the bourbon comes through very clearly. It's maybe not quite as intense as on the first beer, which is okay. That's not a criticism. It's just explaining what I experienced. There's definite intense bourbon flavors. It tastes a lot more bourbony in this beer than it did on the prior. I'm tasting a lot more of the actual spirit that is bourbon and less of the bourbon characteristics that we associate with bourbon. I'm not getting as much vanilla. I'm not getting as much underlying molasses. So there is still a bit of underlying molasses to this one. There's not as many kind of caramelized brown sugar notes that are coming through either, but it's very nice. It's bourbony. And the boozes, there's a little suggestion of it, but it's not what I would call a boozy profile at all. Not by any stretch of the imagination. It's much more the spirit itself without the booze. And then the malts in this one, very deep, very rich, very roasty. I would say it's kind of teeter-tottering between earthy and smoky, somewhere in this hazy gray area between the two. There's no real suggestion of coffee at all. There's a slight suggestion of, say, cacao or like dark baker's chocolate, but it's not that intense. It's a lot more true, actual malt flavor characteristics for the roasty edge that they put on it that's coming through in tandem with actual bourbon that's coming through. So it's very unique in terms of a bourbon barrel aged imperial stout. I haven't had a lot ever that present themselves quite like this. This is much more ingredient centric, ingredient focused than kind of all of the other characteristics that go into these things that we normally associate with it. It's almost like a raw ingredient, very raw, but very well put together version of this beer style. And let me tell you, I love it. So I'm going to jump in for body and mouthfeel. Think of the flavor development and finish in the balance here. Very nice on first sip. Yet again on sip number 2, agitating like crazy around the palate. Not really picking up anything. On second attempt, I got a little bourbon. I think that's residual flavors sticking around. Immediately upon swallow, the bourbon comes through even more clearly. On second sip, there is a little slight, and I mean super slight, suggestion of a slight bourbon booziness to it. And there's a little more of these bourbon characteristics that came through on second sip. So I got a little more of the classic kind of bourbon vanilla-like, but it's pairing a lot more with that kind of boozy side of the bourbon. So it doesn't taste like true vanilla. It's like suggestion of it mixed with booze. And the malt bill came into its own a bit more intensely. And I can tell you on this one, I stand by what I got on an initial sip. It's very much somewhere in this gray area between smoky and earthy. That's how the malt bill is coming through. There are very subtle suggestions of very dark cacao or baker's chocolate. But other than that, it's pure bourbon and it's pure malt. And it's this very interesting, delicate balance between the two. They each have their own voice and they come through in different intensities in different spots on each sip, but it's absolutely beautifully balanced. Just a delicious, I would say, you don't normally think of a style like this as delicate, but I think that's the best way I could describe what drinking this one's like. It is a delicate drinking experience. Sure, the flavors are big, they're bold, they're pungent, they're intense, but there is this delicacy to them. Like if you blink and you kind of miss it, you really have to be paying attention with what's happening in this beer, or it's going to get lost on you and you're going to miss the subtleties of what it's bringing to the table. This is a real beer connoisseur's barrel-aged Imperial Stout for my money. I drink a lot of beers. And God knows I drink a lot of barrel-aged Imperial Stouts. This is one that makes you think, and it's a nice, fresh breath of fresh air. It really, really is. It's as delicious as any I've ever had, and it's just got a balance that is just immaculate. But you really have to pay attention to what's happening the whole time, from the instant you get it in your mouth till long after you swallow, to get the most out of each sip of this beer. You really got to be paying attention. You really got to be scrutinizing, what is my palate detecting, and just let it run through. Doesn't matter. You don't have to pigeonhole it. Just think about, what am I experiencing, and then start laying it out on a line, and you can start to kind of build the picture of what this beer is all about. I am a big fan. So many beers like this are just so big and bold and pungent and in your face, and not saying that this one is light by any stretch of the imagination. I'm only saying that it's incredibly complex, and there are layers of subtlety here that are not found in your average barrel-aged Imperial Stout, and I am a big, big fan. This one's so crazy. I'm going to finish getting just the last little drops here. I'm going to jump in for one more small, tiny sip just to get final thoughts, make sure I didn't miss anything here. Third, and that was just basically a swish. I got a lot more bourbon as I was swishing. As soon as I swallow, that bourbon is still the first thing. It's a very intense, very present bourbon notes that are up front. And there's that suggestion of booziness, but it's just this light suggestion. It doesn't really taste or feel boozy. It's just that suggestion that's there. And that lingers longer and longer with each subsequent sip. And then on the back end, that's where all these malt characteristics are coming through. And I got it true to form on the first two sips. It is this hazy gray area between smoky and earthy. There's not really any other interplay there. It's just this weird area that kind of rocks slowly back and forth between the two. It's earthy, it's smoky, it's earthy, it's smoky, it's earthy, it's smoky. It does this kind of interesting dance, all the while dancing on this bourbon that's just holding this very calm, static consistency and intensity all the way through. From the moment it pops in, it just seems to hold there. Granted, first sip, it kind of ramped up, plateaued, then ramped off smoothly. Second sip, it's almost like immediate hold, and then this super slow, subtle drop off. So it's got interesting different arcs and shapes on the different intensities of flavor profile development that you get on each subsequent sip. That's not something you get in a lot of beers, but I got to tell you, it is absolutely a breath of fresh air. The way this one finishes, it lingers with bourbon haunting on the back of the palate with this underlying, again, it's still somewhere between a smokiness and an earthiness on the malts. And it's a little bit more intense than you would expect, particularly considering how relatively subtle this beer is compared to other beers of its style. But it's there, and it does push the length of that finish out just like you might expect from a barrel-aged Imperial Stout. This one is really unique. It's very interesting. I'm going to take my time, sip on this, come with my scores. When we come back, we will get both beers ranked from top to bottom. Okay, now that we've gotten to enjoy both beers, we're going to get them ranked, starting with the Crux Fermentation Project, or Crux. Tough Love. This is a Kentucky Bourbon Barrel Aged Imperial Stout with blackstrap, molasses, and spices added. 11.5% ABV. They are based in Bend, Oregon. Starting with the aroma, this was one of those classic barrel-aged Imperials that was just pungent across the board. The aroma hit you from a good 2 feet away. Closer you got, the more intense the aromas, and it was all in there. Perfect 10 out of 10. For the taste, I loved it. I absolutely loved it. This was near as perfect just about as a barrel-aged Imperial Stout comes, for my money. It was just loaded with flavor. The bourbon was top quality. It was the right amount and the right balance with the other ingredients. The blackstrap molasses added this additional layer of depth. Still had a lot of intense roast edge that came through. The subtle spices were in the background, kind of all interplaying. It was just a fantastic all-around beer. Tasted phenomenal. 10 out of 10. For the body. The body was quite large, though I gotta say for the style and the ABV, it was not quite as large as I anticipated, but it didn't miss the mark by much. I only docked 1 point here. It gets a 9 out of 10. For the mouthfeel was positively huge. Just a boatload of resistance. It felt right. It felt like a big stout that had a nice, resistant, viscous body. Gets a 10 out of 10. The finish. The finish on this one was exceptionally long. You know, barrel-aged stouts in general, you never really know what you're going to get. This one was huge. It really lasted a long time. Just lingering bourbon, lingering roast, lingering additive flavors. They all just went in to make a very long finish on this beer, and it was nice and round and wet to the end. Gets a 10 out of 10. Head and retention, this one poured just about as perfect as it gets from at home. Easily could have been pulled off of a tap. It gets a 10 out of 10. For the appearance on this one, absolutely pitch black, exactly as expected. Nothing more to say there. It gets a 10 out of 10. For the balance on this beer was exceptional, and I alluded to this when I was talking about the flavor profile. The balance between the bourbon notes and the beer notes and the additive ingredient notes was just incredible. Oftentimes you'll get a barrel-aged beer where the barrel just is so strong it overrides the beer. Sometimes you'll get it so weak, what's the point in paying that extra price? This struck the balance perfectly. All of the classic malt bill flavors came through, all of the barrel came through, all of the added ingredients came through. That's a perfect 10 out of 10. Feeling in the tangible, subjectively, I absolutely loved it. It gets a 10 here as well. Finally, as an example of the style, as you might expect, so far it's swept all but one category and it's only lost 1 point, and indeed that is the case. Example of the style, perfect 10 out of 10, which brings Crux Fermentation Project's Tough Love to a 99 out of 100. As I said, just about as good as it gets. Moving on to beer number 2, this is Friem's Bourbon Barrel Imperial Stout, 11% ABV. They are based in Hood River, Oregon. The aroma on this one was equally as impressive as on the first. All of the same characteristics as well. The bourbon came through really strongly. The classic malt bill backbone came through perfectly strongly and clearly, and it was in great proportion. It gets a 10 out of 10. For the taste on this one was absolutely incredible as well. Yet again, it was a similar beer drinking experience. Both of these were absolutely top tier. The flavor on this one, very nice bourbon barrel flavor that came through. Very deep, nice roasty malt bill that came through, and they were in unison. It gets a perfect 10 out of 10. For the body on this one, similar story to the first. It wasn't quite as robust as I expected, but it didn't miss the mark by much. I docked 1 point here. It gets a 9 out of 10. For the mouthfeel on this one, absolute boatload of resistance. Just really silky when you moved around the palate. This was another one that was big and wet and round. Felt that way on the mouth and on the palate, and really it just was so viscous. It was close to being syrupy, but without being off-putting. I loved it. It gets a 10 out of 10. The finish, just as with the first, the finish on this one was just impressively long. And for the same reasons, it was pungency of flavors that pushed it through to the end. And we're talking both the roast from the malts and we're talking that bourbon barrel far longer than most. It gets a 10 out of 10. Head and retention. This one did a really great job, though not quite as good as the first beer. It was close to looking like it was pulled off of a tap. It only missed the mark, by a slight margin. I gave it a 9 out of 10. Appearance, as anticipated, pitch black, exactly what I expect. It gets a 10 out of 10. For the balance on this was really nice. Frankly, as pungent as the flavors were and how long they worked together to push out the end of the finish, I would have liked a little more of that roasty edge to come through, and I would have liked a little more intensity from the barrel as well. The barrel came through a bit more clearly than the malt bill. I think if the malt bill had had a little more intensity or volume of the really deep roast, it would have helped, but I'm really nitpicking here. I only docked 1 point. It gets a 9 out of 10. Filling in the intangible. Yet again, I absolutely loved it. I mean, this is just fantastic beer. It gets a 10 out of 10. Finally, as an example of the style, Just as with the first beer, it nearly swept it across the board. This one only lost 1 point in 3 categories that weren't that big of a deal in the overall picture. So yeah, it gets a perfect 10 out of 10 as an example of the style, which brings the total score on Friem's Bourbon Barrel Imperial Stout to a 97 out of 100. So 2 points apart, a 99 and a 97. As I said, these beers are just about as good as it gets for barrel-aged Imperial Stouts. Absolutely worth your time if you can get your hands on them. Folks, that's today's review. As always, I do sincerely appreciate you tuning in today. Please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And if you want to stay in the loop when our videos go live to YouTube, you just click the notification bell icon. It's right next to the subscribe button. Until next time, keep it beer, keep it craft. We'll see you on the next one. Cheers.